Here it goes. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And I'm very happy with the guests we have on. We are with Cuban Canadian journalist, activist, anti-imperialist, thinker, and author of several books, Arnold August, who is a contributor to the Canada Files, Telesur English, and has had work published in globalresearch.ca and so forth. But before I introduce him, I also have to mention that very sad this week we lost a giant journalist of monumental man, Glen Ford, the co-founder and executive editor of Black Agenda Reports. So to Margaret Kimberly and all of her colleagues at Black Agenda Report, to the Black Alliance for Peace, the Black is Back Coalition, and so forth, I know for a fact both me and Arnold, we give our deepest condolences to them and to Glen's family. So rest in power and rest in peace to Glen Ford.
I fully agree. How about dedicating this YouTube to Glen Ford? What do you think?
Oh, definitely. So we dedicate this episode. We definitely dedicate this episode in memory of Glen Ford, who definitely inspired me to do this program, and so our deepest condolences to Glen's family and to all of his friends and colleagues, and of course to the movement that he was a part of. So, Mr. Arnold, thank you. First off, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much for coming on the program today.
Thank you. Just before we go on, I like that introduction. It's very kind, except that I'm not a Cuban Canadian or Cuban American. I was born here in Montreal, so I don't know how that misconception.
Okay.
But that's okay. That's no problem. That's no problem.
My apologies then.
No problem at all.
My apologies to that. You're so knowledgeable on Cuba, and I believe you also speak Spanish. So I must have. Right. So I must have.
Well, in fact, I've had a lot of discussion with my colleagues in Cuba about that. I said it's much better that you, as a Canadian, speak about Cuba rather than us Cubans speaking in defense of Cuba, which everyone knows we're going to do. So this is sort of a running joke I have with my Cuban friends.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting, and I'll hopefully we'll be able to return to that. Okay, so right. Well, my apologies for that mistake.
No problem.
All right, so Mr. August, so the first question that I wanted to ask you is, can you explain to the audience, even a left-leaning one, which oftentimes subscribes to anti-communist thinking and sometimes the left, the Western left often engages in what I call self-McCarthyism, right. And I want you to sort of push back against that. And so, can you explain how the Cuban Revolution was a popular people power revolution, briefly?
Yes, it's a very good question. For the audience to really get a grasp of people's power revolution, one has to go back all the way back to the 19th century, because in the second half of the 19th century, the Cuban people took up arms against the Spanish occupiers. And this was a mass movement, including ex-slaves, the poorest sections of society, also relatively wealthy people as well, but in a struggle to liberate Cuba from Spanish domination. Now, in the course of this struggle, they actually liberated areas, and within these liberated areas, they had constituent assemblies, 4 constituent assemblies, to which they elected delegates, and these constituent assemblies debated and adopted constitutions. Now, in these liberated areas, you also had land reform, you have literacy going on, and various other social activities were being carried out. It's sort of, I guess we can say,
but this is all before Castro and Che led.
that's right, right. But in order to get a feeling of what happened in the next century, we have to go back to this, because the roots of the People's Revolution in Cuba in the 1950s, 1960s, finds its roots in 19th century Cuba, where you had these liberated areas, sort of a state within the colonial apparatus. And thus, this was going very well until they were about to liberate Cuba, but the Americans stepped in and they robbed Cuba of their liberation. And after that, when that happened in 1898, basically the United States ruled Cuba until the revolution was rekindled. That same revolution of the 19th century was rekindled on July 26, 1956, when Fidel Castro and others took an offensive in order to start the revolution again. That actually failed, July 26, 1953, I'm sorry. But they came back and returned to Cuba in 1957, the famous landing of the Granma yacht in 1957. And within a short period of time, just to show you once again, Youri, how the Cuban Revolution is steeped in its alliance, its close relationship with the people, with the grassroots. They established liberated areas in the Sierra Maestra, and similar to what happened in the previous century, carried out land reform and other activities until, of course, this led to the successful triumph of the revolution on January 1st, 1959. Now, there was no elections in Cuba after January 1st, 1959 until 1976. But this doesn't mean that it wasn't a democracy. This doesn't mean that it was not a popular revolution. On the contrary, in one of my books, I quote something from Fidel Castro, where he said, look, he raised in 1959, 1960, he raised the issue of elections in a mass meeting. And the people say, no, we don't want elections, because their only recollection of elections were the type of elections were held under the United States domination, the so fraudulent multi-party elections and all that. So the Cubans carried on their revolutionary struggle, building what they had to do in terms of illiteracy, social programs, nationalizations, until finally they had elections starting in 1974, 1976. But they have their type of elections. I don't think one could look at their type of elections from the perspective of how we, or not we, some people see elections in the West, whether it's North America or Europe.
In a classical liberal democracy sense.
So they have their type of elections and democracy, and but I think one of the most important things is not just the elections, but how the political system in Cuba is geared to involve people in the day-to-day activities of the state. For example, they recently updated their constitution, okay? And in that, you had millions of people discussing at the grassroots level in the neighborhoods their view on how to amend the constitution, which was finally adopted and voted upon by the vast majority of the people. So it's another perspective. I think we have to look at Cuba's revolutionary people's party from their perspective, and now not how we see it or some people would see it from the West.
That is fascinating, and that's a perfect segue to this question, which is, do you now because some people when they think of Cuba, they're or when they think of a communist states, whether it's the former USSR and the Eastern Bloc, even the People's Republic of China, they have this sort of George Orwell version of history, which is the people were liberated from whatever tyrannical governments came about, but then later the revolution dissolved into tyranny. So Fidel Castro is this is this Stalinist figure. I don't really want to go want against that, but I just sort of, but I wanted to ask,
Yeah.
what are some of the criticisms, if you have any criticisms, of Fidel, Raul, and yours truly, Che, when they did, when they did come into power with the Communist Party of.
Okay. Well, if you don't mind, Youri, let's have some fun. Let's turn the tables on the critics in the West, right?
Yep.
Let's ask them, what's your issue? Why do some of these, armchair critics sitting very comfortably in their living rooms in Canada, United States, Britain, Belgium, or whatever, so enthusiastic to criticize Cuba? What's their issue? So I've been working on this quite a bit because it comes up very clearly now when you have all this controversy with regards to what happened in Cuba, the July 11th demonstrations and all that. And, it's sad to say, Youri, but here we are in 2021, and we are still burdened with Rudyard Kipling's end of the 19th century concept of the white man's burden, right?
It's actually it's so funny that she mentioned that, because I often get into arguments with people, or when I talk with like-minded people, I say to them that I am so tired of these Western do-gooders who have these imperial blind spots and engage in this white person's burden syndrome, just like what you just mentioned, because that's exactly the frustration I have with people who say we need to do something about Assad in Syria. We need to do something about China and what they're doing in Hong Kong and what they're doing in Xinjiang. And you get this exact same thing with Cuba. So sorry to interrupt, but
no. I'm glad if you like it. It is an important thing. This white man's burden is an important thing. It is still with us, even more so now. Let's take example, what's happening now. There's a lot of controversy what's happening now in Cuba. So you have people, of course, let's take the United States. I'm sure we have a common problem with the United States, you and I. So you have, people taking stands on what's happening in the United States. You have Bernie Sanders, AOC, the Squad and all that, and what did they say? We're against the blockade. We're against with any attempts by the United States to try to subvert the situation in Cuba. But there's a problem of political freedom. Why is the Cuban government suppressing the people and all that? So these white man's burden mentality, they just can't help themselves. They just have to criticize country such as Cuba. It's very disgusting. Like Bernie Sanders, I saw him right from the beginning when he announced several years ago, we're organizing a political revolution as part of the Democratic Party, which is known by Glen Ford and his colleagues and others and you and I as a gravedigger of mass revolutionary movements against the system. So they just can't help themselves. They just have to criticize countries such as Cuba or the government such as Cuba. And this comes up often, far too often. So that doesn't mean that everything in Cuba is perfect. I don't believe in this position either that, well, no country is perfect, talking about Cuba versus the United States. That's not the issue. United States is perfect. It's a perfect bourgeois democracy that is based on the state as a continuation of slave society and the genocide against the native people. So that state is working perfectly.
And still ongoing brutal subjugation.
It's still ongoing. Exactly. It's just so still ongoing. So it's perfect. So you just can't talk in that way. The Cuban system, they have to stand, it has to be evaluated on its own features, on its own standards. And there are many other examples of, for example, when it comes to Venezuela, okay, these white do-gooders, they can't help but saying, of course, what the United States is doing against Venezuela, which is, by the way, just trying to squeezing it to death. It's no good. But at the same time, Maduro, was he really elected in a legitimate way and things like that? They just cannot help themselves. And I personally, I'm disgusted because this goes on for a long time. And unfortunately, some people on the left give credibility to these social democratic do-gooders who look in a disparaging way to the countries in the South, the peoples in the South who are doing very well, organizing their own revolutions. Just take the example of Bolivia, Cuba, Venezuela. There are many other examples, but those critics from the North, where's your revolution? Where did it take place? On what basis do you give yourself the right to criticize others? Now, in my books on Cuba, I deal with certain weak spots in the political system there. But what I do, I don't give my view. I interview revolutionary colleagues in Cuba who give their view on what they think, how things can be improved there. It's not me talking. I open the pages of my book to the audience to listen to what Cubans have to say on how to improve their system.
Fascinating, and that's exactly why people need to get your books, and it's on my list of books that I need to get in the future.
Right.
So in that, so before we get to the current events you just mentioned, I just wanted to then ask you, briefly, if you can explain this. Why was the Bay of Pigs sanctioned by JFK? Why did it turn into such a fiasco, given how successful the U.S. and Canada and its allies, because oftentimes, especially back then, the U.S. and its allies were very successful at overturning democratic socialist governments and progressive governments. Now, but why did they fail in the Bay of Pigs in overturning Cuba's revolution?
Yeah, here, that's a good point. This goes back to the very first point that, in fact, you and I were making, that it's a people's revolution that started in the 19th century, carried on later. So in 1959, 1960, 1961, the Cubans, after taking political power, they made sure that they were going to maintain that political power. So you had the organization of militias, people having able to organize themselves as militia in conjunction with the regular army to defeat the American aggressors. That was quite a feat, and they actually did it. But the United States, of course, with their Eurocentric mind, or US-centric outlook, they cannot believe that the people in the South could organize and defend themselves against a power such as the United States. And of course, they were defeated, and they have not attempted since then to have an open aggression against Cuba. Even, of course, as we know, they are trying other indirect methods to achieve the same goal of overthrowing the Cuban Revolution.
That's interesting. So, do you think that the reason why Kennedy, the CIA, weren't able to overturn the Cuban Revolution was simply because that that the Cubans were very smart in learning from the mistakes of their forefathers, the region itself, and that because it was, as you mentioned, very much a people power revolution, it came from from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. And that's why the U.S. wasn't able to defeat them militarily with the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah, I guess we could say the Americans. I mean, not all the Americans, but the U.S. rulingly, they so much believe in their own mantra that in a communist country such as Cuba, the government imposes its will, and the people are against that. But the actual, so they got that all wrong. The people and the government were together since 1959 during 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, and they were able to successfully defeat that power of the United States. But the American outlook just cannot get rid of that notion that in communism, the government ruled against the will of the people. And that's the same narrative they're trying to push now in July 2021 with regards to the so-called protests in Cuba.
fascinating. And one last follow-up question. So Cuba manage to did Cuba manage to resist U.S. domination with the Bay of Pigs fiasco? Did they manage to do that completely by themselves without the aid of the Soviet Union, or?
Well, in 1961, it was completely without the aid of the Soviet Union. But after that, of course, they developed when of course there was no chance of developing good relationship with the United States, which Cuba always wanted to do, by the way, including Fidel Castro. Right from the beginning, they were interested in having good relation with the United States, but based on mutual respect. You have your thing going in the United States, but you have to respect our sovereignty. When it was clear that the United States was not going to collaborate in any way, but rather trying to subvert the Cuban Revolution, Cuba saw correctly that they have an ally in the Soviet Union, and that's when they started to build close ties with the Soviet Union right after that.
Okay, that's interesting, and that is a perfect segue to this question. Now, the U.S. and its allies have rediscovered, unfortunately, that they have a grudge against Cuba and are once more trying to overthrow not just the government there, but the entire system of policies of social justice, universal healthcare, and so forth. They're weaponizing the coronavirus crisis to do it. They're weaponizing the issue of human rights, medical shortages, food shortages to do it. But of course, one can't describe why Cuba does struggle with all of these issues without going to the root cause of all of this, which is the embargo. So can you explain the embargo the U.S. put in place on Cuba after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how it's gone progressively worse from JFK to Trump and to the current Biden?
I just like expand at one point. You said that the Americans rediscovered that they have a grudge against Cuba. You know, I don't know if you meant it or not, but there's a common conception that with Obama, Obama forgot about that grudge and he wanted to, have better relations with Cuba. I think that's a very dangerous point, a very dangerous point of view. Let's look into that before we get into the blockade, which is also part of the question. Now, what Obama did, what he said was, our policy in Cuba is not working. We wanted to isolate Cuba from the rest of Latin America. However, the United States became increasingly isolated, and not Cuba, who won the support of all the countries of Latin America. So Mr. Obama said, we have to change our tactics. And instead of using aggression by the previous government, they were going for seduction, aggression, seduction, but with the same goal, to subvert the Cuban Revolution, the same goal. So so one has to look at it that way. There's a lot of misconceptions about Obama. Like it was very good that he opened this up. One of the best things, of course, that the Cuban Five were freed, and some positive economic policies were opened up. But at the same time, his basic goal was to subvert the Cuban Revolution, and he did not lift the blockade when he could have done so. He could have closed Guantanamo when he could have done so. But zeroing into a bit more closely to what you're asking, the question of the blockade, that began almost right after the Cuban Revolution, 1959, 1960.
So it's a misconception to think that the embargo only started after the Cuban Missile Crisis. No, it started.
Actually, the concept of the blockade was actually worked out in 1960 by the then Undersecretary of State for the Hemisphere, James Mallory, in which he said, I'm quoting from him, it's not from me. He said, Cuba, we have a problem with Cuba. Everyone supports the Castro government. What we have to do, we have to put a squeeze on the Cuban government, in other words, the blockade, in order to make people bring about dissatisfaction and an uprising, economic distress, and an uprising hoping that the Cuban people will blame the government for their economic hardship. But
Wow.
that was the basic goal of the blockade in 1960, and it's right to this day. Now, I think the blockade has been going on from then. I think an important a milestone in the blockade was in 1996 when President Bill Clinton organized the Helms-Burton Law, which made before 1996, before the Helms-Burton Law, the blockade was like a one-on-one thing, the United States against Cuba. But in 1996, with the Helms-Burton Law, they converted it into an extraterritorial law, so that other countries, third countries, are actively pressured not to do business with Cuba. So that, of course, upped the ante a lot. But of course, since then, it's been going on all the time. And of course, Trump made it far worse during his mandate. He enacted over 240 measures to increase the blockade against Cuba, and you're in the time of a pandemic. So it's not 242 new measures, but in the time of a pandemic, which is, disastrous, and had a very important negative effect on the Cuban economy and the Cuban people. So the worst thing is, of course, that Biden is actually carrying on. He did not lift a finger to remove those measures, which he could have done. But I saw this coming quite a bit. Some people say, well, he didn't follow his he didn't follow up in his on his promises. What did he actually say? What did Biden say about Cuba? He said, we are going to look into the Trump measures, look into it, and perhaps revise it, but always keeping in mind our core values of democracy and human rights. So here you go. They leave the door open. Anytime they want, oh, there's a problem of human rights in Cuba, we cannot lift the blockade. And what was the other promise that he made? People forget that. They're try to paint Biden into some kind of a positive figure compared to Trump. He also promised this, Youri: I am not going to be like Trump. I'm going to stand up to people like President Xi of China, to the Castros, even though they're not in power, to Maduro. Remember that? He promised. So actually, so I and other people, like, for example,
as if Trump was some kind of a soft person on the designated enemies.
Yeah. So that's why myself and colleagues from Black Agenda Report, we were saying, look, Biden is going to perhaps be worse than Trump. He's going to be most aggressive. People say, oh, you're crazy. Come on. This is a struggle against fascism. How can you try to divide the struggle against fascism by opposing both Biden and Trump? But what has happened since that time, Youri? We have unfortunately, proven to be correct. Look what he's doing right now against Cuba. He is, right today, he has added more sanctions against Cuba. After the sanctions that he enacted 2-3 days ago. So he's really going for the jugular against Cuba. You can't get any worse than that. Some people, even I think the Cuban officials are saying that there was more contact during the Trump period than there is with the Biden period. I mean, Biden is really going for the jugular against Cuba. So he's carrying out his electoral promise. I'm going to stand up to the Castros. I'm going to stand up to these guys and all that. So this is a very serious situation. I hope people are learning from it. And that's why I'm glad we're dedicating this episode to Glen 4, because if you read my books, one of the things that I draw from the Black Agenda Report is the struggle against the so-called two-party system. What they would say that, the notion that the lesser of two evilism. I have always opposed this in the United States and the equivalent and lesser of two evils. Either you're against the two-party system or you're not against the two-party system. That's why, someone like Chomsky, I think if you might have a question about Chomsky, of course, I have a lot of respect for him. I quote him in my book with regards to manufacturing consent. But at the same time, someone like Chomsky, okay, every time push comes to shove, oops, let me just
tends to support the two-party system. The Democrats as the lesser of evil compared to the
Exactly. So twice, like in the 2016 election, he supported Hillary Clinton. Now he supported Biden. So how long does this go on until people take a stand against the two-party system? So and today we're talking about what's happening in Cuba today. Chomsky signed with other people a statement, white man's burden type of statement. Of course, what the United States is doing is wrong, trying to interfere and all that. But at the same time, there's political repression in Cuba. The Cuban government is violating the human rights of the Cuban people and all that. So once you are in that rut, you cannot get out of it. And it's really important, I think, that the people on the left, whether it's all, especially in the West, that they break away from this context, this pressure that of supporting or creating illusions about the two-party system.
I completely agree with you on that. And then one quick follow-up then about the embargo.
Yes.
Was it under Bill Clinton in which he strengthened the embargo by basically saying that any country that does trading with Cuba, so it could be Canada, it could be Belgium, any country that's a member of the European Union. So anyone that wants to do any sort of economic trade with Cuba, they'll be sanctioned. Their businesses will be sanctioned.
Yes, right. That was a result of Bill Clinton's action. But it's interesting to know, like, what happened? Why did he do it? Cubans, unfortunately, are always in a no-win situation. That period of 1990s, the Cuban Americans in Miami were carrying out all kinds of provocations against Cuba, including sending military aircraft in the airspace of Cuba. And Cuba was very patient. Look, stop doing that. We have our airspace. We have a right to respect our sovereignty. But the United States kept on doing it, or these Cuban Americans kept on doing it with the, agreement of the American government. So at one point, the Cuban government had to act. And when those aircraft enter the Cuban airspace, there's no doubt about it, they enter the Cuban airspace, the Cuban government shot them down. But Clinton used that as a pretext to enact the Helms-Burton Law. Now, in the Helms-Burton Law, I don't know if you want to go, there's one important aspect.
Go ahead, explain.
Title 3 of the Helms-Burton Law means that an American, even if he's born in the United States or living in France, or whatever, has the right to sue a Cuban entity in Cuba, for example, who has built a hotel or on a property that used to belong to their family, whether it's Spanish or Canadian, building a hotel on the property that used to belong to their family. So under that Title 3, they have a right to sue those people in Cuba. But Clinton did not enact that Title 3. He kept it on the back burner. So that was good. But Trump did enact it for the first time about a year and a half ago, opening up further pressures against the Cuban government by giving the green light for people, Cuban Americans or Cubans living in Europe, to sue Cuban entities in Cuba. And so this is an added thing, but of course, Biden hasn't taken that back either. Biden is really carrying out the Trump administration Cuba policy. Like I've been in a lot of talk shows and all that. I think I always have this joke. Sometimes people say, well, that was a historical election against Trump, against fact. Yeah, it was historical. I agree. But why? Because the first time in the history of the United States, you have two Republican parties vying for power in Washington. Because for example,
center right and far right.
Right, like for example, Biden, his main support came from the Lincoln Project, which are anti-Trump Republicans, right? I guess you remember that.
Yeah.
So you have the hardcore Republican Party, and then you have a light Republican Party led by Biden. So yeah, it's historic. The first time you have two Republican parties. So I think it's important for the people of the world, when we look at elections in the United States, we just can't look, well, this election took place 4 years later, another election. But you have to look at it in a concrete way. And that is what happened in the last elections. And I think this is, a lot of people were fooled by this notion that we have to stick together in the anti-fascist struggle. So this is part of the learning process, but I think people are learning. It's never too late, Youri. People, I think, are learning about the American political system.
Yeah, and it's and no doubt Cuba is no stranger to these two rival oligarchic fascistic parties constantly violating their sovereignty. And I think, and so that being said, when we talk about the embargo, on Cuba, is it safe to say that, okay, even if there are food shortages, even if there are medical shortages, and even if there are people who are frustrated with the state of affairs in Cuba, yes, let's grant that there are genuine protests, that there are people who have legitimate grievances, but is it safe to say that most of the dissatisfaction and most of the economic problems that Cuba faces all goes back to the embargo, goes back to those sanctions of mass destruction?
Yes, exactly. I mean, like if we look at the news since July 11th to date, okay, like what is the main feature of it? It's a major assault against Cuba. One of the main feature is, wow, look at all the problems in Cuba, while completely ignoring the main cause of this problem, which is the over 60-year-old devastating blockade against Cuba. And some people on the left even fall into it. They talk about human rights, there's a problem here and all that. But how can you take the Cuban blockade, as you say, out of the equation? It does not make sense. Now, yes, there are grievances, but there is a lot of discussion in Cuba. I was in a webinar on Cuba a couple of days ago. So what I always do, I speak to I can't go there, so I speak to my friends by telephone. I have a lot of colleagues there. I'm not a Cuban Canadian, but I have friends there. I call it. So I called a couple of them. One of them said, it doesn't matter how bad things are, to go on the streets and to get intermingle with these counter-revolutionaries who are calling for the defeat of the government. This is not acceptable. He literally told me, it's like handing to the Yankees the sovereignty on a platter, on a golden platter. At the same time, there is serious discussion. Other people, revolutionaries, did not take that stand. They are saying, look, we have to admit that some people, ordinary people, were actually involved in these demonstrations, even though they did not know it was being organized from abroad. And we have to look into look into the problems. Why are people so dissatisfied that they actually participated to a certain extent in these demonstrations? So there is a lot of debate. Like I think you mentioned earlier, you have this notion that's presented. Cuba communist, it's gray. People are afraid to talk. There's no debate, no discussion. I could tell you from my own experience, if there's a country in the world where you have so much discussion and debate, Cuba is a good example. So you have someone else saying, that we have to be self-critical. This is a well-known intellectual writing in a pro-government newspaper, saying that we have to be self-critical and look at the problems. Where do we go wrong? That some people actually will go on the streets and mingle with the obviously anti-Cuban people there. So this debate is still going on. It's not over yet. And I think one should not estimate, like Miguel Diaz-Canel, the president, when the first when the first demonstration took place in San Antonio de los Baños, just west of Havana, he actually went there. I mean, what other president, he actually went there, without anybody, and he spoke to the people there. And in an impromptu press conference, right after, he said, look, I know there are obviously we know that this is instigated by the United States, counter-revolutionary in the United States. But he said also there are revolutionaries who are confused, and it's up to us to clarify things. So Cuba is going through this important, discussion and debate at the grassroots level, at the level of the leadership, and how to deal. Like, you mentioned there are real grievances, obviously. Just for example, people have to wait in line for a long time in order to get food. This is normal because when the stores have to limit the amount of people that go in one at a time. The same thing happens in Europe and North America. So there are long lineups. There are many problems, but you cannot deal with any of these problems without pinpointing that blockade that's been going on for 60 years.
Yeah.
That's why I have a big bone to gripe with these Sanders, the squad, and all that. Instead of criticizing Cuba, just keep your mouth shut against Cuba and just tell your boss Biden, take that blockade off. Just that. Forget about criticizing Cuba.
Yeah, exactly. And a question. Then another question I wanted to ask. Because now when I was reading Mint Press News and other outlets about how Cuba was coping with the coronavirus pandemic. Now, I was under the impression that Cuba was actually handling the coronavirus pandemic very well, yes, and that they even had a vaccine that they wanted to export to the world, but they were unable to do it. Now, is that because of American and Western European big pharma monopolizing the pharmaceutical industry? And if there is still an ongoing pandemic in Cuba, I mean, again, sorry to be repetitive in my question, but that again, we have to blame on the that we have to blame on the embargo, which is why there are medical shortages and so forth.
Just like what you said about like what happened. Cuba is sort of in a difficult situation. Their economy is based very much on tourism. So when the pandemic hit, I'm from Canada. People are always flying to Cuba from Canada. Bath, overnight, tourism ended. A major blow to the Cuban economy, which is already reeling from other causes,
which is bled because of the embargo and because
exactly. So the Cuban tourism industry stopping almost instantly had a major impact. So the Cubans, of course, always try to get things going again. And I think they opened up Varadero Beach a month or so ago to tourists, especially from Russia. And from what I've heard, a lot of these tourists coming from Russia, some of them, Russians from Moscow do not have a reputation of being very disciplined, according to my Cuban colleague. And they probably inadvertently brought some of this COVID into Varadero. And that province of Matanzas, in which Varadero is located, had a major problem in terms of it was a disaster. Hospitals were full. People were in the, scenes that we would never see in a country such as Cuba. This actually happened. But, like as you say, you can't just, when the tourism industry would stop and the Cubans tried to reboot it, that it was a no-win situation. And this is what happened there. But I think what is important to look at is what you mentioned, that despite this, the Cubans have elaborated 5 vaccinations against COVID-19 on their own steam. This is really something. Other countries have done it, but the only country in Latin America to have done that is Cuba. That's a great accomplishment because they knew that in order to save lives of the Cuban people, they cannot rely on American big pharmacy from the United States or even from other countries because, Biden, they would have no qualms about stopping vaccines going to Cuba if it would help them to subvert the Cuban Revolution. So the Cubans decided right from the beginning, they have to have their own vaccinate, and that's what they did. And of course they have that as a result of the long-standing effort of the Cuban people. This, by the way, was initiated, the idea of Fidel Castro. He says that what we need is to build this pharmaceutical industry in order to help contribute to the well-being and the health of the Cuban people. And not only that, they have built their own vaccines and other products to fight COVID-19, but they also sent medical brigades. I'm sure you heard about that. Your medical brigades to other parts of the world, including wealthy countries such as Italy. When Italy was, one city in Italy was virtually submerged by COVID-19, no one in Europe, no country in Europe volunteered to help Italy. Who helped Italy? Cuba. And there are many other examples. Wow. And their new vaccine that they produce is being exported to countries such as Venezuela. So you have, the negative thing about the United States, even under Biden, or more so under Biden, is carry on their aggressive policy against Cuba, against the third world. You have increasing collaboration. I think this is one of the most important things that came up positively out of the pandemic, even though we don't like to talk about positive things. But you have, for example, the rise of China, as a mortal force in the world. And it's right from the beginning, they said, we are going to produce vaccines, but it'll be for free and it'll be for the world. So you have China, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Russia, all collaborating.
But how come then? Because I would have preferred to have taken the Cuban vaccine as opposed to the for-profit ones of either Pfizer or Johnson Johnson. So how come many people don't get access to the Cuban vaccine? Their choices are either AstraZeneca, the Johnson Johnson one, or Pfizer.
As you say, it's big pharma. I mean, they're the ones who control everything. In the capitalist system, there's only one thing that counts, as you know, is profit. Where the countries that, or the governments or the system the United States are trying to overthrow, such as Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, their orientation is entirely opposite. It's the people first. We're talking, as we right from the beginning of our discussion, we talked about the Eurocentric, versus the thinking coming out of the South. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Two opposing views with regards to society.
So, so is it only the very, very poor and desperate that are getting the Cuban doctors as well as the Cuban vaccine, as opposed to everyone else who, even if they are in a very precarious situation, their only choices is whatever big pharma dictates? Then
that's right. I mean, there's no other choice for people. It's in many countries in the South. I mean, they have no vaccinations at all, such as Haiti. There are many other examples. I mean, it's so obvious that the pandemic has brought to the fore the nature of the capitalist system, which is incapable of dealing even with its own people. Like the United States, the richest country in the world, they were incapable and still are incapable of dealing with COVID-19. When it's unthinkable, Youri, that the health system should be in the hands of private corporations. That's why they hate Cuba, because the health system it's state-run and it's run by the people. It is not run by individuals who see health as a source of profit.
Yeah, and not only that, Vince, I remember talking with Cindy Sheehan just last just last Monday evening of July 26th, 27th, and I was saying to her that that I was stunned that people could weaponize the coronavirus as a way to overthrow the Cuban government, when I would give most of the Western world a humongous F in their monstrous ways that they handled the coronavirus. And then you look at a country like Brazil, led by this sociopath Bolsonaro, and you don't see these people going you don't see these Western do-gooders or these people with the white man's burden saying we must intervene in Brazil because look how bad they're handling the coronavirus.
Exactly.
Yet they're doing that with Cuba, which is
Yeah. I mean, that's really obvious. That's why it really rubs me the wrong way when the squad, so-called left of the Democratic Party and all that, they cannot even think that United States, it's so arbitrary that they're singling out Cuba for COVID, while their closest ally, Colombia, is a disaster. So many people dying. That fascist Bolsonaro and Brazil, so many people die, but everything's okay. They have good relations. They're not trying to overthrow that government there. But if Lula ever wins, which he probably will in a year from now, you'll see that same United States, who had nothing to say against Bolsonaro, the fascist, will go into overdrive to try to subvert a new government led like Lula. And that's, of course, what we're going to do with Peru as well. That was a great event, Youri, that the left-wing anti-imperialist candidate, an ordinary peasant, I think of native origin, actually won that election. That was a major breakthrough. So, a lot of bad things are going on, but at the same time, I think that in general, in the world today, especially in Latin America, but I would say all over the world, the pendulum is swinging to the left. And I think that's why United States is like a wild animal, trying to stop this tendency where people are looking to for an alternative to capitalism. They're looking for an alternative to U.S. hegemony in the world. They are rather looking for the need for a multipolar world to put a stop to the U.S. hegemony over the world.
Yeah, as well as their partners in crime, England, Canada,
Yes.
the Five Eyes, and NATO.
Exactly. Yes.
And
Exactly.
Actually, that's a perfect segue then to this question, which is now, what are your opinions and assessments? Researching Cuba, being in Cuba. Now, this is probably a repetitive question, but what are some of the half-truths, if any, that the powers to be are using in their attempt to stage a coup, a counter-revolution, and a color revolution in Cuba? So what are the half-truths, if there are any, that about what's going on in Cuba with the protests, or what we seeing in the news mostly just fake news and of a attempted coup that's going on in Cuba?
Yeah, well, of course, there is this half truth, which is really a truth, that there are serious economic problems. There's no doubt about it. Social problems. Even the health system is overburdened with the COVID-19, and there are so many problems like that. So it's not really it's the truth. But the thing is, one cannot underestimate the pride of the Cuban people to build their own society. There was a really interesting event took place today. Youri, I don't know if you saw it. You know that there's the United States and their allies, their paid allies, have been carrying on a cultural war against Cuba. In Cuba, an important theme is patria o muerte. In other words, fatherland or death, which means that we are ready to give our life in order to defend our sovereignty. So the Miami crowd changed it to patria and life, patria and life. In other words, the homeland and living, and they call this the anti-communist manifesto. To oppose the Cuban notion of defending their sovereignty. Just today, in the Olympics in Tokyo, a Cuban boxer won a medal, and he went in the ring and said, "Patria o muerte, venceremos." And that was really a very important thing.
And that's the slogan in solidarity for Cuba resisting imperialism.
Exactly. That he stood up there in the ring and said, "Patria o muerte, venceremos." So of course, that puts a big hole in all of the U.S.-led propaganda that people are all following for this point of patria or vida, fatherland and life, as opposed to fatherland and defending yourself. So this is the type of thing that's happening in Cuba, and that was of course the Cuban media were really happy, but haven't seen anything from Miami. They haven't said anything about this boxer. they keep on repeating, that they're trying to involve Afro-Cubans in the struggle against the government. But that Cuban boxer is an African Cuban, and he really he really made a very important point in that ring today, and it reverberated all over the world for those who, of course, would allow this type of thing to be said in the mainstream media.
So it seems to me is it safe to say that again, as you've stated many times, yes, there are people protesting Cuba. There are people who are frustrated with the state of affairs, and yes, there's this kind of shortage, there's that kind of shortage, there's this kind of deficiency. But is it safe to say that most of the Cubans themselves know that the embargo is to blame for most of this, and okay, so some are being exploited by external factors, the U.S. and its allies, in destabilizing Cuba, but that most Cubans, at least in Cuba, are not falling for this attempt at regime change, color revolution, counter revolution.
No, not at all. These problems exist. There's no doubt about it. But the Cubans know, we're talking about, from one generation to the next, since 1959, 1960, that the blockade is the main cause of their social and economic problems. But the United States tries to hide the fact that the Cuban people and the government are together. Like you had the July 11th sporadic protests, which were in fact quite small. Only a small number of people participated in it who were, even though they were not against the government, but to express their grievances, their concern with regard to the situation. Now, on July 18th, 1 week later, unless you follow the Cuban newspapers, you would not know that there was a huge demonstration in Havana, 100,000 people in Havana, with the leadership, Diaz-Canel, Raul Castro in Havana, expressing support for the Cuban government. Of course, this was blacked out, but what the media said, like CNN. I have a gripe against the Squad, CNN, all these liberals, Patrick, all these, exactly. Israel. What he said, the CNN guy who's in Havana, he said people were bussed in. They were taken by bus into the area to demonstrate, to try and give the impression that people were they were forced to demonstrate and all that. But they cannot. This goes back to our very initial discussion when we started. It goes back to the ingrained notion in the North that people in the South cannot think for themselves. They cannot defend themselves. They cannot work out their own political issues. And so they try to just deny it. They called it a government demonstration. So I wrote a small tweet. That's great. Thanks for letting us know that this is another example of participatory democracy. We have the government and 100,000 people demonstrating together in support of the Cuban Revolution. Yeah, a government demonstration. But they're so caught up in trying to denigrate and to hide the fact that the Cuban people are, despite all the problems, are with majority. I'm not saying all.
Yeah.
The vast majority of Cuban people are with the government in defense of their sovereignty and their dignity.
And that's a perfect segue then to one of my last questions, which is the expat community of Cuba, based in mostly based in Miami. Now, can you talk about the politics of the Cuban expat community mainly based in Florida and elsewhere? Their organizations and their role in wanting to continue the Cold War on Cuba. And do many of these expat communities, the organizations they're part of, do a lot of them harbor very far right politics? Do many of them have links to the Batista supporters that fled Cuba?
Exactly.
And so, in other words, should we be very much keep them at arm's length, these these Cuban American expat communities who
Yeah, well, actually, we have to, actually the Cuban American or Cuban expats in Cuba and the United States, it's actually divided. The impression is given that all Cuban Americans are against the Fidel Castro. They want to overthrow the, but there are so many Cuban Americans who are fighting to demand that Biden lift the blockade. I can give you many examples. So but we never hear about them in the mainstream media in order to give the impression that the Cuban Americans that are pro-annexation, that is, they really believe that Cuba should be annexed to the United States, that they represent a public opinion in the United States. Let me give you an example how bad these guys are. I did some investigation on my own with regards to one, like the main slogan, SOS Cuba, okay? Save Ourselves Cuba. It was first published in the United States by someone called Yosbani, okay? Yosbani is a Latin American pronunciation of U.S. Navy. Like they pronounce a V as a B, Yosbani.
Yeah.
Okay. Now this guy, he came from Cuba, settled in the United States, and immediately got a job with an outlet called CubaNet that is financed by the National Endowment for Democracy. Also got a job just mysteriously with Univision, which is the main Latin American channel that beams in Latin America against Cuba, against Maduro, etc. He just, mysteriously got a job there. And this person is the one who started that hashtag in the United States, SOS Cuba. So it just shows how
SOS Cuba, safe to say, it's entirely deep state. It's entirely a CIA operation.
Yeah, and Alan McLeod and the Men Press showed that very clearly in his article. I contributed in a small way to that article, I think, called "The Bay of Tweets," and Max Blumenthal recently came out with another one indicating very clearly that this whole SOS Cuba is all organized from the outside. It's not from Cuba, Spain, Argentina, United States, but not in Cuba. So, and of course, the impression is given in the mainstream media that the Cuban American expats are in favor of that. And they don't give any publicity to the thousands and thousands of Cuban Americans and their allies in the United States who are demanding that Biden lift the blockade against Cuba and support Cuba's right to self-determination.
Interesting. And so yeah, because we often do get we often do get this impression that a lot of the Cuban Americans based in Florida or whatever part of the United States, that they all have anti-Castro, anti-communist derangement syndrome, and that they all have very, very reactionary far right politics. But what you're saying is that yes, there are those organizations and there are those groups, and they are very well funded. Yes. But it would be wrong to say that a majority of Cuban exiles want to not just it would be wrong to say that they're all far right and that they're all counter-revolutionary.
No, of course, but look at the media. We'd never know that. I don't know how many are hard, these right wing, and how many are really patriotic and are against the blockade and all that. But it's definitely split. It's not unanimous for sure. And I think, but one cannot underestimate these people in the United States. I mean, in Miami, they are really for annexation of Cuba to the United States, as it was, we talked early in the 19th century. And I think that the
So,
situation.
so they actually would like Cuba to be like a territory,
Yeah, just like Puerto
like
Rico.
Puerto Rico.
Exactly. Like this is like this. The issue of annexation in Cuban politics goes all the way back to the 19th century. There's always been a sharp struggle between
Wow.
annexationists on the one hand, and people who defend the sovereignty of Cuba. And this is still going on now. So you have inside Cuba, these hip hop people and all that. Or I think he's meeting with Biden yesterday or tomorrow. I'm not sure, but they're this SOS militants are actually going to meet with Biden. So Biden's becoming a hip hop specialist, meeting with them and all that. So it just goes to say, so this is, they actually when this whole movement started a year ago in Havana, these artists, they actually had as a slogan when the elections are going on, vote for Trump, invade Cuba. They actually call on the United States to invade Cuba, to liberate Cuba from communism. So this, they say this in the United States, they say this on live broadcast in the United States and Fox News, and every chance they get, there actually is a move for a further interference by the United States in Cuba. And we cannot, despite Biden being a Democrat and all that, one cannot have any illusions about Biden and the Democratic Party.
And do some of these organizations with ties to with ties to CIA and all those front groups like the National Endowment of Democracy, now were many of them founded by by people that had links to Batista and to organized
yes, of course.
And to organized crimes like the Sicilian, Italian American.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Like we spoke earlier with regards to the Bay of Pigs. So one of the main bases of this move, or these organizations in Miami, are some of the veterans of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. So they never swallowed the fact that they were defeated, that some of them are still alive, and they are calling on the United States to try for another invasion of Cuba, some kind of interference in Cuba in order to get rid of the government. So this is a very serious situation that's going on in the United States now with regards to Cuba. That is why I don't want to repeat, but those on the so-called left, the squad and all that, who say, well, we're against what the United States is doing, but, human rights violation, why the hell are they talking about human rights violations in Cuba when the United States and its allies in Miami and else are actually trying to intervene in Cuba, even to the extent of militarily to overthrow the government? And they're talking about human rights violations in Cuba. These guys should be ashamed of themselves. And people on the left in Canada who say, well, we support the squad, they're really cool, AOC, they should be ashamed of themselves. I've been writing a lot of articles against the squad, and I said AOC, AOC once came to Canada to speak on a Twitch event with the leader of the Social Democratic NDP party. You know what I said? Let us be careful, Canadians on the left. I say, AOC, Yankee, go home. I think I'm very forthright. Instead of beating around the bush, like when John McCain died, AOC and Bernie Sanders.
She and the NTP were lionizing him. Yeah,
they're so that really shows the mentality of this so-called left of the Democratic Party. You just scratch, and under that you see the American notion of exceptionalism, the beacon on the hill for democracy all over the world. When Biden made a speech, his town hall meeting or whatever, a few days ago or a week ago, he said, United States, despite everything, despite January 6th, United States is still a beacon on the hill for democracy all over the world. Well, this fraud squad, don't you have anything to say about that? Because that really shows the nature of U.S. imperialism. And there's a dividing line between, on the one hand, the AOC and the real revolutionary left in the United States, such as Black Alliance for Peace, such as the Gray Zone, People's Dispatch. There's so many. And I think it's important that people see through this thing. And I'm very happy I raised that slogan, AOC, Yankee, go home. Why the hell should we beat around the bush?
AOC, another outstanding con artist, right?
Right.
But then, but in that said, Mr. August, like, it's funny because I have a copy of a DVD of this of this movie called The Lost City, directed by Andy Garcia, the Cuban American actor, and it's a movie which is very critical of of the Cuban Revolution, human rights abuses. He plays a guy who later goes into exile and so forth. So that said, now how would you approach some of these Cuban Americans or even Cuban Canadians whose family fled Cuba, and assuming that they weren't supporters of Batista's and don't have reactionary far right politics? How would you approach somebody like Gloria Estefan, Andy Garcia, or I even saw a pop singer I like, Camila Cabello, who was doing hashtag SOS Cuba? How would you approach them? In the hopes that you could have a rational conversation with them about why they should not be supporting, that they should not be, giving their blessing to what is basically de facto, a coup going on in Cuba, and how would you approach people like, you mentioned AOC and others who say that, oh, I'm not for the Cuban government, but I do want to lift, the blockade. So how would you approach?
Well, there's two different things. One is these hardline, Miami types. I don't think it's really possible to have a rational conversation with them. I mean, from what I see, I'd be always willing to do it. There are Cuban Canadians who feel that way, are very rabid anti-Cuban government for U.S. intervention in Cuba to liberate Cuba from. I'd be willing to discuss with them. But from my experience, their mind is set. They're really they just don't deal. Like in Canadian newspaper printed a quote from one of these right-wing Cuban Canadian saying that the police go into the apartments of the Cuban people, they arrest them, they tear their eyes out. They're just amazing. They just fabricate things that have nothing to do with reality. So how the hell can you have a conversation with them? With regards to the others, like the Social Democrats or Social Democratic sympathizers in Canada, or the AOC squad type, I say, sure, I think we should confront them on that. We should discuss that with them, But I think the only way to do that is to be firm, not to just say, well, it's good that you oppose the blockade, but either just oppose the blockade and shut your mouth up about anything else what's happening in Cuba. Let the Cubans take care of that. Just you deal with your government who's carrying on the 60-year-old blockade against the Cuban people. I mean, we have to be frank with these people, no?
Well, I agree with you, and so from your experience, from your experience is when you've tried to have some of those rational conversations about, okay, I understand that you have these grievances, or you don't like the current system, but honestly, do you really think that if the U.S. was to overthrow Cuba, everything's going to be all hunky dory? But from your experience, that a lot of those, again, this goes back to my previous question of these expat societies, that they're actually not really interested in having some kind of a social democratic model in Cuba, that they really just want to completely overturn.
There's no doubt about it. Like, there's no real room for discussion. They really want the overthrow of the Cuban government and to annex Cuba as a colony or neo-colony, that is, directly or indirectly, that Cuba should be part of the United States, just the way Puerto Rico is. So I don't think there's any room for discussion with them. I mean, personally, if I was face to face, I would try to discuss with them, but I don't think very much will come out of it, because they're used to just trying to denigrate people by saying, oh, you're just a castroid and things like that. So I don't think that's the way things are now. There's not really room for discussion. But we should encourage those people in the United States, Canada, and Europe Cuban Americans who are living in these countries. We should encourage them and support what they're saying with regard to their own country, so they feel that they're supported by us. And it's part of one struggle to defend. We're talking about Cuba's right to sovereignty, self-determination. That is the issue. Whether you agree or not with the Cuban government, Cuba has a right to its sovereignty, its own government, the way they have developed it over the decades.
My second to last question is there any opposition in Cuba or even outside of Cuba? Because you mentioned that there actually are voices in Cuba that are not on board with regime change, not on board with regime change, not on board with the ongoing embargo, and want détente and an end to the war on Cuba. So, is there any opposition in Cuba or outside that wants the socialist system to remain in place, but would like to see a change, but would like to see a more Western-styled social democratic system as opposed to the current Marxist system, or a sort of a Trotskyist model, or is most of the opposition outside of Cuba and even within Cuba all just counter-revolutionaries who the moment they get the levers of power, not only would they would basically overturn everything, get rid of the wonderful socialist education system, the socialist healthcare system, where they just completely make everything
Well, that it's an important question, but it requires a very long answer, which I cannot give today. But in my last book, Cuba U.S. Relations, I deal with that in detail. That's why it's a very controversial book. In that book, and as I say now, inside and outside of Cuba, you have that tendency, what I call centrist or the third way. That is, they, we don't oppose the Cuban government, but at the same time, we don't agree with the Cuban government. We have to have some kind of a change there. But what they are really for, like you have the Miami crowd, they're for a hard coup. Then you have these centrist or third way opportunists. They are rather in favor of what I would call soft regime change. That is under the hoax of not being opposing the blockade, at the same time saying that Cuba has to open up towards its political system, to allow other parties, to allow more, to allow capitalism and all that. They are really pushing for a soft power regime change in Cuba. That is, a multi-party system, capitalism and all that. And they actually exist in Cuba. They actually exist in Cuba. They have positions in Cuba. And of course, they exist in academic communities in Canada, United States, and Europe. And I think that now, with the current situation, it's like they're coming out of the closet, and they're taking advantage of the situation to say, we were right all along. Cuba cannot carry on this way. It has to be, it has to listen to the grassroots, open up for more political parties, more political freedom, and more capitalism, things like that. So Cuba is really facing two attacks, in my view. Not everyone will agree with me, especially the centrists and their supporters. Open attacks by Biden, the American government, and then you have the centrists, third way, such as AOC and academics in Cuba, United States, Canada, and Europe, who are taking advantage of the situation and say, Cuba has to open up. Cuba has to open up in terms of politically, socially, and have a different economic political system. So Cuba is really in a very difficult situation. What is really going on against Cuba now? It's a major cultural war led by the United States against Cuba. And what is the main target, Youri? It's socialism. That is their main target. They are afraid of socialism, and the centrists, the third way, or the fraud squad, they are the most dangerous because they give credibility to that position that there's a need for a change in Cuba, outside of the the current type of political and economic system that it has now. So I think Cuba is in a very difficult situation, but they've been in a difficult situation before, and they have support and friends all over the world. Like, when Biden tightened the screws against Cuba, you had Bolivia, Russia, several other countries sending boatloads of food, medicine, etc., to Cuba. So Cuba has a lot of friends, all over the world. So, those people who are calling for soft regime change, they should hang on, because it's not going to be that easy for them to try to overthrow the Cuban government, even through soft regime change type of tactics.
So even if there were an alternative left opposition within Cuba, or even outside do you believe that if even if they were promised a position by the powers that be, and the powers that be listened to them and did overthrow the Cuban government, that their version of socialism is not going to be implemented, that it would be sort of like what's going on in what happened in Eastern Europe, what happened in Russia after the capitalist revolution happened there?
Well, in Cuba now, or outside of Cuba, what you say, the alternative, there's no such thing as an alternative left. Within the Cuban political system, as I explained with the examples, the debates going on now, different opinions on how to evaluate what happened July 11th, just a few weeks ago, that in Cuba at this time, there is debate amongst the Cuban people how to deal with the situation. There's plenty of space there for debate. I've seen this so many times over the years. Whenever important issues crop up, people take part in the debates in order to solve the situation. Everything has to take place within that. Those alternative left outside, they are part of the soft regime change policy of the United States, and they know it. And I know them, and they know me. That's why they don't like me, but I don't care. I will call out centrists and third way people at any time, because I think that they are the dangerous ones. They create illusions about regime change coming especially from the Democratic Party and Joe Biden. So no alternative left in Cuba, no, there's no such thing. Those who are alternative,
but within their system, as as you mentioned, there's lots of
exactly
arguments, robust
exactly.
conversations, dissents within the Communist Party about the best way forward. How do we deal with day-to-day problems?
That's very well put. Within the Cuban political system, there's ample space for discussion and debate, and that's what's going on now, as it has in the past. Those who do not want to be part of this debate, they are actually either on purpose or not helping the Biden regime change plan for Cuba. We have to be frank. That's what they're doing.
And my last question, and I'm going to have you back on the program to talk more about this last question of mine, which is Cuba's real role in the world. Now, of course, whatever criticisms people want to make about Cuba's domestic problems, or how Cuba approaches its domestic issues, one thing is for certain, without a question of a doubt, is that Cuba is more of a force for good in the world. Cuba actually is a force for good in the world compared to the United States, and certainly compared to yours truly, the country you're based in, Canada, right?
Right, exactly.
And so just list 3 examples of how Cuba has actually been a force for good in the world.
Well, force for good in the world. I think one important point is, in Latin America, over the last years, Cuba has been working very closely with Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and other countries in order to build an alternative to the Organization of American States in Latin America. And I'm very proud what they're building there, the CELAC, which is the community of Latin American and Caribbean nations. It includes 33 countries. And I'm very proud to say that Canada and the United States are not part of that. And that's the way it should be. Why should the United States and Canada be part of a South American, Latin American regional bloc? They have, they are part of the problem. They should be out. So Cuba, right from the beginning of this move, has been working initially by Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, and now taken up by their successor, of building a regional bloc in Latin America to develop the economy and social being of Latin America. There's a second important point. There's a move going on now. I think it was initiated by Venezuela. It's called Friends of the United Nations Charter, and they're building an alliance of all countries who simply agree that the United Nations Charter, which opposes economic sanctions and other arbitrary measures, that this should be stopped. The United States should take action against countries such as the United States, such as Canada, who support sanctions against these countries. Those are two. I would add as a third thing, I think we touched on it initially, but I think it's really important. We are in the process of seeing the development of a multipolar world. That is, where you have, just to mention a few, you have these Latin American countries, the Latin American countries, Venezuela, Bolivia, now Peru, soon Brazil, Nicaragua, and others, right? Along with Iran, very close ties with Iran, Russia, Vietnam, China, of course. So you have the development of the multipolar world. And what is the main objective of the multipolar world? Is to oppose U.S. hegemony. Some people say, "Oh, well, Russia, Putin is not a socialist." Yeah, he's not a socialist, but at least he opposes the United States. I mean, I spoke to my friend a few days ago, and he mentioned to me that he was really happy after Biden slapped those last sanctions against Cuba. He was happy that Putin, on the orders of Putin, sent ships to Cuba with food and medicine and all. So you have this multipolar world building up right under the nose of United States, Canada, England, etc. I think, and Cuba it's a small country, but it punches way above its weight, over its weight. And is helping to promote this multipolar world. So I think these are the 3 points that I think, in terms of what Cuba is doing to contribute to the situation in the post or still pandemic era. Like you mentioned, irrespective of one things of Cuban politicals, I would say that because of Cuba's political system, that is, it has maintained political power, that they are able, on that solid basis, contribute to these regional blocs in Latin America, internationally, etc., against U.S. domination. I would just like to mention, I've said this before, and you probably guessed from what my feeling is, that the United States, in my view, my humble view, is the most aggressive, barbaric state since Nazi Germany. You could quote me on that. If you're not sure, look at, they support Israel. Can you get a more barbaric fascist state than Israel? No. The United States and Israel are the only countries in the United States, in the United Nations, that voted against the Cuban Revolution, a Cuban resolution to lift the blockade against Cuba. So, any country, whether it's Putin or President Xi of China, Venezuela, Iran, Vietnam, any country that takes a stand against this barbaric United States, I think that this is a very important contribution to humanity.
All righty. Well, on that note, do you have to go now, Mr. August?
No.
Oh,
I know we've been together for a couple hours. Drop the Mr. August. How about you call me Arnold?
Okay, well, do. Well, before I have you go, another thing I have to add to what you just mentioned is that Cuba defended the South African resistance against apartheid. Cuba always, exports their doctors into every country, no matter if they're being targeted by sanctions or not. Cuba sends their doctors everywhere to help alleviate, the problems they face. Cuba also fought on the side of Angola against
Right.
against U.S., South Africa, and even my mom's country of the Congo's imperialism there.
Yes.
And of course Cuba was, and of course every country that was under siege by the U.S. and their allies during the Cold War, Cuba pushed back against all of those fascistic movements, right? From Nicaragua to Pinochet in Chile and so forth, right?
I'm glad that you mentioned Africa. I would have mentioned it, but I was, careful not to take up too much time. But Africa is really important. I mean, what Cuba did in Angola is of historic significance. Opposing the apartheid regime and all the other support that they have given to Africa. While on the other hand, United States and it was really increased greatly by Obama, with the AFRICOM Obama period against Africa. And the Black Agenda Report has specifically written many articles against the dirty role of Obama, I guess, using the fact that he's the first Afro-American president to do what? To oppress and colonize Africa more than any other president beforehand. So Cuba is, like Cubans say that African blood is in the veins of the Cuban people. I mentioned the 19th century struggle. That struggle actually began in 1868 when an owner of a sugar refinery who had slaves working for him, he liberated his slaves and said, if you are now free, you were invited to join with us in the struggle against Spain. And they did. And that's the way they were able to liberate large sections of Cuban territory, because it was a joint struggle by the former African slaves and the Spanish plantation owners, or who originally came from Spain, against the common enemy, which was Spanish colonialism. So Cuba is a country. Of course, it's really very cynical that the United States, whose state is a vestige of slavery, is trying to stir up controversies and struggle in Cuba to try to get the Afro-Cubans against the Cuban government. And I think our friend Margaret Kimberly, she wrote a great article a few days ago just on that. She really hit the nail on the head when she said that Afro-Americans have to be careful what the United States is saying with regards to Afro-Cubans and trying to get the Afro-Cubans in revolt against the Cuban government. So anyway, I'm glad that you raised the question of Africa. It's really very important.
And what's been the role of Univision in propagating people against Cuba? Now, Univision is one of the largest Spanish language news entertainment outlets for the Latino population in the United States. And now they tend to be pretty progressive when it comes to the rights of immigrants, Mexican immigrants and illegal immigrants. But when it comes to their international politics and specifically Latin America, are their politics very, very and their coverage very reactionary and very much like pro-American empire?
The Univision foreign policy is the same as Washington. There's no difference at all. In fact, I would say that they're in the forefront of trying to push U.S. interference and U.S. domination all over Latin America. I mean, on the question of Venezuela.
Even when it is even when you have somebody like AMLO in Mexico, who's a very, very moderate socialist reformer, will Univision always slander him, will always try to undermine him and depict him as a terrible leader, just as they would with Hugo Chavez, who was a democratically elected socialist government, or Evo Morales of Bolivia, and I know, and in Nicaragua too, they've also been slandering Ortega and his People Power movement as dictators and so forth, right?
I'm glad that you raised the issue of the Mexican president, because just we mentioned the CELAC meeting that took place recently, the Caribbean and Latin American Regional Conference that took place in Mexico. And AMLO, as president of Mexico, he was the one who presided over it. And he made a great speech. I mean, he's known to be as a moderate, right? Well, he is a moderate, but he made a very strong speech in support of Cuba against Biden's policy. He said Cuba should be given a peace prize for dignity. I think he said they should be recognized as a human symbol of dignity. And he made a very strong statement in support of Cuba against the United States, and also support of Venezuela and support of Ortega. So I didn't see how Univision reacted to that, but they surely did not like it. And what is interesting, he's known as a moderate, but we're talking about the pendulum swing to the left in Latin America. Not only you have Venezuela still holding strong, you have Bolivia, you have Peru winning and all that, Nicaragua hanging on. Hopefully Lula will win and all that. But you even have someone who's already been elected. He seems to have moved more to the left, when he made that speech in Mexico just a few days ago. So I think it's contagious. Things are moving to the left. At the same time, we have to be very careful, because the United States cannot accept, this leftward movement in Latin America or any place in the world.
So you would suggest to anyone from Latin America who does immigrate to the United States or to Canada to stay away from Univision, because the more they would watch, the less they know, or
yeah, well, they could tune into Univision, but they also should look to alternative media that comes out of Venezuela, if they're Spanish speaking, that comes out of Venezuela, like Telesur.
Yeah, exactly. I was just about to say yours truly, Telesur.
Cuban TV. Okay, watch Univision if you like, but look at alternative sources as well in Spanish. There are, I think mentioning Telesur is really important to support Telesur Spanish and Telesur English, because they offer an alternative to that Univision notion that people in Latin America naturally have to gravitate towards U.S. policy.
And Telesur, a follow-up question on Telesur. It's been a while since I followed Telesur, because it's been under intense sanctions, and a lot of Western leftists tend to punch left. And like I say, they engage in self-McCarthyism towards Telesur. Now, is Telesur one of the only Latin American outlets that that offers a broad range of socialist views, including communist views? So Telesur will not denigrate the communist movement of Latin America and elsewhere. It actually will highlight some of the achievements and some of the good contributions communist movements have made to the struggle in Latin America against imperialism. And
not only does Telesur do that for Latin America, they open their broadcast news and all that for people and the journalists to provide a view on what is happening in Venezuela, Bolivia, Peru, and the negative stories, what's happening in Chile, what's happening in Colombia and all that. At the same time, they even have correspondents in China. They have correspondents in Syria. So it is a really important outlet, I think, that people should support, both the Spanish and the English versions of Telesur. I don't think there's anything like it. They have sister organizations, for example, in the Middle East. I think that Russia Today, in my view, is also very good alternative media in opposition to U.S. hegemony. And there are other examples. So we're not alone. I mean, I see your outlet has a lot of views, a lot of subscribers, and I think everyone makes an important contribution.
Thank you. Well, and just before I let you enjoy the rest of your Friday and your weekend, I have to ask you this question in memory of James Lipton. He did this questionnaire towards all of his guests. So I'm going to ask you these questions, and don't worry, it'll be very quick. So, Arnold August, what is your favorite words?
My favorite word?
Yeah,
I would say Marxism. One word or two words?
No, that's a good one.
Marxism.
What's your least favorite words?
My least favorite word is pro-imperialist.
Pro-imperialist. I believe I asked. Yeah. I believe I asked you. What's your what inspires you?
What inspires me? I would say the same thing as what Chase said. He said it's not one word. So he said, anyone who trembles at the who opposes the injustice in the world is a friend of mine. I feel the same way. Hardly a day goes by or a minute goes by, an hour goes by watching the news, reading about what's happening, whether it's in Palestine, Latin America, Africa, whatever. There are anyone who opposes what is happening now, caused by the Western powers, is a friend of mine. It's more than one word. It's more than one word.
No, that's great. What turns you off?
What turns me off?
Yeah.
I would say what turns me off most are the centrists, the third way hypocrites. That's what turns me off most.
I completely agree with you. What sound or noise do you love?
The sound of noise that I love?
Yeah, what sound or noise do you love?
I like the sound of the sea. When I try to relax, which is hard for me to do, I try to imagine myself, on a sea, close to the sea on a beach, and listening to the waves coming in and out.
Well, yeah, you got the perfect shirt to try to do that. And what sound or noise do you absolutely hate?
What I hate, the noise that I hate is the noise coming out of CNN by liberal CNN. that is the noise that I hate. Don Lemon, Jake Tapper, all these guys. That's the noise that I hate, and I call that noise. It's not reporting. It's
exactly.
Just noise.
Exactly. Right. What's your what is your favorite curse word?
My favorite curse word?
Yeah.
Is Yankee go home. Is that qualify? I don't know.
I can take that. So
I mean, looking from the point of view of a Yankee, it is a curse word, right?
Exactly. What profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to attempt? So if you weren't doing journalism and so forth, what other profession would you like to do?
Well, to tell you the truth, I can't think of anything else except journalism, So I really have to say there's nothing else that I would like to do. The people say that a journalist is either writing or thinking about writing. And, that's what I'm all about. It's hard for me to get out of that rut, if you want to say. It's either writing or thinking about writing.
What profession would you absolutely not like to do under no circumstances?
I would never speak on behalf of a multinational, of a corporate media. Never. If they ask me to go on, say okay, but I will not support any regime change buzzwords.
That's a good one. And the last one, before I let you enjoy your weekend. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates?
If heaven exists, if he would say to me, if I would arrive there?
Yeah.
Well, if he said, well, well done. I think you accomplished something in your life. Thanks a lot. That's all that I would hope for.
All right. Well, we are joined on this edition of 1+1 with Arnold August, a frequent contributor to Telesur, the Canada Files. He is the author of several books on the U.S. and Cuba, and he was our guest on this all things Cuba edition. And of course, just before I stop the recording, once more, both me and Arnold, we send our sincerest condolences to Margaret Kimberly, the rest of the team at Black Agenda Report, Black Alliance for Peace, the Black is Back Coalition, and the entire People Power movement over the loss of Glen Ford. His revolutionary spirit lives on within all of us, and he will be sorely missed and never ever forgotten. So,
exactly. And a shout out also to my friend Netfa Freeman, who is part of the Black Alliance for Peace as well.
And as Glenn would always say, power to the people.
Right.
Power
right.
to the people and death to the fascist imperialist pigs.
right.
So thank you so much, Arnold.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun. I hope that you enjoyed it as well.
Oh, I did.